Welcome to the Never Again Is Now podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller, a co-founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, Thin Edge of the Wedge. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest with a small Jewish community. And my grandparents came from Latvia and Russia at the turn of the century, 20th century. My U.S. Army officer husband and I were stationed in Munich only 25 years after the end of World War II. This podcast is being done in partnership with Evelyn Marcus, a Dutch Jew and the daughter of Holocaust survivors, who was featured in the documentary Never Again Is Now. In 2006, she immigrated to the United States because of the rise in anti-Semitism. Our guest today, who I'm so appreciative of, she's calling in from Frankfurt, is Karen Youngblood, who will now tell you a little bit about herself.
Hello. Hi, Phyllis. Hi, Evelyn. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of your podcast, Never Again Is Now. What a appropriate title of a podcast, and how important it is these days to really go into what it means, the words never again, and particularly what it means for them to be talking about now. So my name is Karen Youngblut. I'm calling in from Frankfurt, Germany. I work for the USC Shoah Foundation for the last 25 years. USC Shoah Foundation is the Institute for Visual History and Education at the University of Southern California. And I myself grew up in Germany. I was born in Germany, and I did my grammar and high school in Germany, and afterwards spent most of my adult life actually studying and working in the United States, and just recently returned, I guess in a way, to Germany again. It's been 4 years now, to work for the USC Shoah Foundation in a number of different programs and projects with global partners.
And it's part of your personal and professional 4 years now in Germany. Have you experienced anti-Semitism directly?
I myself have not experienced directly anti-Semitism, but I have experienced it or had to deal with the impact of anti-Semitism very directly and in a number of different ways, especially because of the work we do. In being involved with many survivors, speaking with many survivors, also continuing to interview survivors about their experience. But I think I would say I will give two examples that I think are quite representative and reflective of what's really happening. We as the Shoah Foundation, we conducted survivor testimonies since 1994. With Holocaust survivors all over the world. We have an archive with over 55,000 testimonies of survivors of the Holocaust and other genocides. It is mostly about the Holocaust. And as part of this collection, we also have, in the 90s, done about 900 interviews in Germany with survivors and Jewish survivors who lived in Germany at the time. And within the last year, the son of a survivor, the survivor himself who gave testimony, has passed away a few years back. But the son contacted us and urged us, actually I would say begged us, to take the testimony of his father out of the archive. And why? The testimony of his father was, in a sense, only accessible at universities that our archive is accessible, which is about 160 universities. In Germany, it's 3 or 4 universities. One of them is the Free University in Berlin. And the reason he wanted the testimony to be taken out, he has the exact same name as his father. And when you search his father's name, his father comes up as a Holocaust survivor, the testimony being accessible in various places, and so on. And he, out of fear for his own safety as a German Jewish person, didn't want people to be able to find any information about him. And so as a result, actually, of basically current anti-Semitism, he went as far as asking us if it's possible to, take his father's testimony, at least block it. We call it block it for a certain time period, as because he just doesn't feel or didn't feel safe enough anymore. And so for me, that was I've had several conversations with him about it because, also wanting to make sure, because his father did sign a release agreement, and obviously his father went through in, I think, mid or late 90s, through doing the testimony. It's in German, and obviously wanted it to be part of an archive, wanted it to be part of an educational mission. But several phone calls with the son and talking it through, it was clear that we had to adhere, and it was our moral duty to comply with that, and adhere to his wishes, so to speak. But to me, that was a very sort of how shall I say it? A very strong message of what current anti-Semitism and the fear that whether it is perceived, whether it is real, whether you had direct already experiences or you fear of having direct experiences, what it does to people today.
Yes,
that's one.
That's a very good example, a very frightening example, but it certainly paints a very strong picture. Yes, please continue.
Yes. So the second one is actually from also the son of survivors. And we interviewed this person because of, we also have a program where we are conducting interviews about current anti-Semitism in Europe, in a number of different European countries. And we started the collection about 5 or 6 years ago. It was initiated, or in a sense triggered, because of the events in Copenhagen, when there was the shooting in Copenhagen, and during a bat mitzvah, and the security guard of the community center and where the bat mitzvah was held was killed. And our colleagues in Denmark at the time, and we discussed and we started this collection of testimonies, meaning we interviewed survivors and or witnesses to current anti-Semitic events, in particular either violent events or just the experiences that people have now. And we tried to also interview individuals who either observed it, saw something, were impacted directly or indirectly, and also experts and or those who stand up and are doing something against it, so that we can see it from a number of different perspectives. And so in this collection we have about 65 to 70 interviews done in about 6, 7 or 8 different countries. Denmark, Sweden, France, Belgium, a couple of in Germany, and Hungary, and so on. An interview in Sweden that we've interviewed, he was a famous or well-known journalist who also gave his testimony. He was also quite outspoken about what has been happening in Sweden. And in Sweden, it's also a very, very, very difficult space. And he, after he gave his testimony as part of this collection, and there's a couple of things he said. One was, he said, I hate to say it, and he did this in an email to me, I hate to say it, but I'm actually glad that my parents are not alive anymore. Both were Holocaust survivors. Because he felt like they passed away when the rise was not sort of as off, as open, or as it wasn't, let's just say, so much out there. And so he was glad that they would not have to experience it again, in that sense. And in the other sense, he said, you know what, I watched my testimony and I think I have to block it because people will not understand what I'm saying. And one of the things he said that he right now has a very difficult time feeling Swedish and standing behind it. But he said it in a way where he explains it. And it's obviously for those of us who are understanding of the complexities of identity, and you can have dual identity, and what does it mean who we are? It's a nationality, it's a religion, it's an ethnic, it's how we feel, it's, I mean, there's all kinds of, right? It's layered. And he was trying to express that layered complexity about who he is and how he feels about things. But he was so worried that in this current climate, and given his publicity, or his work that he does, and his publicity, that it would be hurtful, and he actually would be more afraid. He's not, he was a bit afraid, but he was really not that afraid. But with this, he said, you know what, I think I cannot do this. So he had to block his testimony because he felt like there will not be enough room for understanding, so for people to understand where he's coming from right now.
And if I understand correctly, these testimonies are not widely distributed, right? So he was worried that even the smaller number of people, it's not like putting it on YouTube. I just want to clarify.
Right. So yeah, so I mean, some testimonies we have a number of different platforms where we distribute our testimony. The entire archive is the Visual History Archive. That is accessible, searchable by the minute, all 55,000 testimonies. That's accessible at about 160 universities worldwide. So you have to go to the university in order to search in the archive, ask for access. So that's, in a sense, somewhat, let's just say, limited, or controlled, however you want to look at it. Reason, of course, being that we are a university, we're part of a university, and for us it is important that this archive is made accessible to students and a university level research. But we also have a platform that is the Visual History Archive online version that is accessible anywhere. So you can search the metadata of all the testimonies, but you can only watch, and I put only now in quotes, about, I think at this point, 4,000 testimonies. So it's it's a certain number of the 55,000 that we made also accessible to anywhere that you can also watch. And so these testimonies that I was just talking about weren't part of that being available everywhere. They were only available at universities. But even with that, there is concern. And so for me, these might be sort of, one might say, anecdotal, like small or like examples of something. But to me, they're actually quite telling.
To me, as a storyteller, I'm like emotional over these. These are very telling, because one of the things that this show really wants to do is talk about people's personal feelings. We can see all kinds of anti-Semitic slogans and everything, but what does it feel to us personally? And when these two anecdotes show how deeply the fear is and how important it is that we admit the fear and then work towards helping reduce it. So I have a very specific question because we have a limited time. I want to know when you personally first learned about the Holocaust.
So, I mean, as I said before, I grew up in Germany. So I grew up in a German non-Jewish family. I'm not Jewish. And I grew up in the 60s and 70s. So for me, it was, in a sense, I cannot point to a time or moment that's when I found out about it, because it is sort of a bit this feeling like I've always known about it. Because it's the thing that at the time, even, it was either something that you heard or it's in school. One thing I know, I didn't find out about it from my family. I think that I can say, and now that I've said this, I actually have to track back. And the reason I have to track back is because it's not quite true. I received a book when I turned, I think, 12 or 13. And that book was called The Exodus, Leon Uris. And of course, that book deals with the Holocaust.
Yes.
And part of that reason of with the book is because what I was told afterwards is that I was named after a character in that book. Because when my mom was pregnant, the film apparently came out with, I think it was Paul Newman and Eva Maria Saint or something. I think it was that
But Paul Newman, definitely.
that version of the film. And so my mom went to the movies pregnant, saw that film, and there was a character in that film. Her name was Karen. And so she said, if this is a girl, I'm going to name her Karen. So that's the story I was told in a sense. And that's why my aunt gave me the book, because she wanted me to know. And so it became, I like inhaled that book, not because of that name giving, because I think I found that out later, but just because I was very impressionable and it was just very interesting book.
Yes, I
Now,
read the
interesting love.
teenager longer for you, and it's amazing, right?
Yeah. Anyway, so that's obviously but I knew already what the Holocaust was when I read the book. So there must have been something in the school. I just know that it wasn't something my family talked about. It wasn't something we talked about. Even World War II was not necessarily something we talked about. What we talked about is, make sure you eat all the food because, be lucky that you have food, and the certain kinds of food that my mom was making, or I knew from my grandmother, is because of what they went through the war kinds of things. So it was really then in high school that I really learned about it. I did have a teacher who we had a couple of projects, and I remember one project which I really enjoyed was learning about Judaism, learning about Jews. And we were talking about Ashkenazi and Sephardi. And then I decided to write a paper on Sephardim. And so kind of not only sort of learning about the Holocaust and basically our, Jewish communities from the perspective of being murdered and victims and targeted, but actually what's the religion? Where do the people come from, etc. So there was all of that type of education that was part of the school I was in. Now I also was in a school that was named after a Carmelite nun who was murdered by the Nazis for being Jewish.
Right. Could you say her name? I do know.
Yeah, it was Edith Stein
Right.
school, and so I think there was sort of a bit of that type of narrative that informed, I think, also how much the school did or the teachers did in order to, teach about the subject. So I had I think, a pretty good education. And then I was part of an exchange program with Israeli students and German students, 16, 17. Israelis from Israel came to Germany. We toured for 3 weeks, Germany basically, with the Israeli students. The first time I went to a concentration camp was actually as part of that trip.
Which camp?
Dachau concentration camp. So we went to the Dachau Memorial concentration camp together, and it was the first time I was in a former concentration camp, and it was with young Israelis. And now we're talking about, it was actually 79, 1980. So, and that was a quite profound experience. And, one of the things with the exchange program, part of this was, of course, for German students and Israeli youngsters to kind of get to know each other. It was sort of this country building, building relationships kinds of things also among the society. But for us, what I remembered was we had so much fun together, always outside of the obligatory, you have to now sit and talk about our history meetings, which we had to have too. But outside of them, we were just mingling. We were friends. We were it was great. But we had these obligatory meetings where we had the Israelis on one side, Germans on the other. And what I remember is, how could you have done this? And the other side, well, we weren't alive. We didn't do it. It was that kind of confrontational, like, discussion, which kind of wasn't going anywhere. But it was fascinating in hindsight now. And just as a little anecdote, we actually had a reunion 30 years later, 2 years ago.
Wow.
The Israelis got together and said, we want to come visit again. And so we actually, luckily I was here and I could partake. And it was great. And we reunited most of those who came. reunited in the same town that we, were together before for 2, 3 days. And that was a lot of fun.
Before we end this discussion, could you tell us how you got into the Holocaust works?
How did I get into the Holocaust studies? I guess because of the school, I think because of the book, I think because of the experience, it was something that that I began to be very interested in, simply wanting to understand how the hell did my grandparents, because that was them, could have done this. These are people I like. These are people I grew up with. These are people I love. How is that possible? It's just on a very basic level, and wanting to really understand what happened and how it could have happened. And let's just say, long story short, I studied in New York, and then I went back to Berlin. I went to Berlin to finish my studies, and while I was in Berlin, the Shoah Foundation started to begin its interviews, begin and look for interviewers. And I was very interested because I did my diploma, master's in international affairs and history, but I wrote my thesis on the deportation of the German Jews. And so it was something that I then also, studied, so to speak. And with that, I heard about the Shoah Foundation. I applied, and the rest is history, so to speak.
Very interesting. I don't think you have to answer this question, but just a yes or no. Did you go back and speak to your grandparents and ask them after you had learned a lot, or was that a subject that was not raised? You don't have to tell me what they said. I just want to know whether you.
I I did not as much as I would have. This is something that I'm really annoyed and upset with myself, that I didn't do it as much. One was, both my grandfathers unfortunately passed away before I really had sort of that mindset, before I really sort of was delved into the history and I could sit them down. I knew certain things about both of them, both on the East Front. One was on the West Front for a while. One was in Stalingrad, came out with the last plane. But I don't know what and where they involved in. I want to do some research at some point where I really want to find out more specifically. Some other relatives have done some research, and we have some bad history in some family, with some family members, clearly. But it's my immediate one is very much sort of we really didn't know anything what happened kind of thing. My grandmother, who died when she was about 100.5 years old. So I did ask her quite a few times when she was in her late 80s, early 90s, and she still was clearly good in mind stuff. And she told me some interesting stories. She told me some stories about they were able to buy some shoes very cheaply from this shoe store, which had a Jewish owner. But it had to be during the night, and they did it in the backyard. They always met in the backyard to do so, because she wasn't going into it, but it was clearly because of the laws that were already in place at the time. She talked about being at a Jewish wedding in 1935, which I thought was really interesting.
Very interesting.
And what she gave as a wedding gift. So that was, and then she never heard from them again. She said they left for the United States or something like that. So, and then she says about things, the city in Frankfurt, for instance, when she takes the public transportation, that there's too many black people and too many foreigners, and you're not allowed to they don't stand up when you come in as a German, and sort of thing. So you kind of get these stories where you go like, okay, what do you do with that, right? Where you really clearly see very racist attitudes, comments, opinions. And then at the same time, well, I did this, and then I did this, and I knew this family. Yes, and, we helped or we did this. But I think I wish I had more time with them, for sure. Because it's all about really understanding. And I'm sure they knew exactly what was going on, and there was no secrets.
Yes, unfortunately, I agree with you that they knew, having done a lot of research, not as much as you, but I've done considerable research. And having lived in Germany, when from September 70 to May 72, every time we got in a tram, we looked at people of a certain age and said, what did they do? And I will tell you that on the tram, the Germans were rude to us, but they didn't know we were Jewish. They were rude because we were part of the
Yeah,
occupying army. And,
right.
if we bumped into someone, we'd say, excuse me in German, and they would never say. So, uh,
Yes, yes. And I mean, there's, debates now today about, what and for many years, like, were we liberated or, we're being occupied, we're not liberated, but, aren't we being liberated? And well, who was actually liberated? And, that whole conversation is fascinating. And then we have this whole transgenerational familial storytelling that has has not has not been successful in Germany, and I think has actually been the opposite in a sense, meaning the silence and or if grandparents shared stories with next generation, because there's been a couple of studies in the last 10 years, it's clearly that these newer generations sort of more and more feel like that the Germans of then were, barely perpetrators. More often than not, did they help a neighbor? More often than not, did they do something good? More often than not, they really didn't know what was going on. It was just a few people that did that kind of thing because those stories weren't told to their kids or grandkids, right? And
right.
so,
On the one hand, we can understand why those stories weren't told. And on the other hand, okay, now I'm emotional. That is why it can happen again. Because if you believe if you believe that people can't be that evil, then it prevents you from seeing what can happen if you don't
yeah,
do something.
yeah. I mean, there's something. When I came back to Germany, one of the things where I was so baffled by the incredible rise of anti-Semitism, not anti-Semitism in itself, but it just it became so public and so open and so prevalent. And I'm thinking, what the hell happened, so to speak? We're 75 years, 80 years later. In this country that was clearly the perpetrator country, this country that clearly stood, that it said we did it, wasn't hiding behind something, let's just put it this way, and in a sense also prides itself for doing so much about memory culture, etc., which is also very controversial because there's so much to criticize about the way it's been happening, because I think it's also failure, a complete failure, which is I think why we're also in the situation we are today. That might be another podcast.
I was just about, yes, and I would love to talk about that because that's,
Because I just feel like, so I'm just going to end with another anecdote, because that to me is also one of those representational things of why things are the way they are. We had a family get together a year before COVID, just cousins. And one of my uncles and aunt came also. They're in their late 90s, early 90s. So they were young adults, World War II. Let's just say kids, young adults. But my uncle was a young adult enough that in the last month or two of 45, he was given a gun, and he was, drafted, so to speak, and supposed to, defend the fatherland. And so then he was talking about this, and he was talking about he had to be on the farm, and he only got to eat something once or twice a day, and he only got a glass of milk and some bread, and he had to, I don't know, sleep in the shed or something like that. And they were talking about, my aunt was talking about, yeah, he didn't do well. It was really hard, and it just like, it was hard for him. And I'm just listening to them because they're talking about it in a very emotional, how much they suffer type of thing. And I know this is a very common thing, but to me it was sort of like so clear, where I couldn't even listen at some point anymore. I had to get up, and I just kind of turned around and I kind of said, you know, you should just also think about what actually you caused, like what this whole war actually caused, and how others, like the suffering that you actually caused with the actions. Sort of think about if you can, with your same let's just say, emotional intensity, feel of what was done to you, also think about what you actually, and you, I put this in, yes, generally you, was done to others, then I would say, okay, we're getting somewhere. But that doesn't exist. It's people, and that they just cannot sort of understand the pain, the what was caused actually, because it's so inward that it's only about how we suffered, that there's not even an opening to, because I almost wanted to say, well, you know what? You deserved a lot more than that because of what you did. Now, of course, I didn't say that. But I was very close to saying it. So I had to leave. I had to just stay away. And I had made some comment about, you should really think about what actually people suffered and what really happened to people, etc. But that to me is sort of this thing about where there was a complete inward looking and not an outward looking, not an openness by that generation to really confront
and learn
the crimes. They confront and if learn, and even, let's just say, whatever learn would mean for them anyway. Be open, admitting it in a sense of kind of standing to it. Even, and I'm sure that for many it was just too hard because it was too painful to realize how cruel we were as people, or their generation is or was. But then you have to think about, these are men that went back home, came from the mass shootings, and whether it's in Auschwitz and the gas chambers, and whether it's shooting in the Ukraine and wherever, and we're family members, we're fathers again, continued to be their police jobs, went home to kids, raised families. That to me is always the most puzzling of it all. It's not about the monsters and the evil. We use these words to kind of describe because we just cannot understand. I think the more fearful thing about this whole thing is that people can do both. They're capable of being both.
Yes, one of the testimonies that I published in the 70s was a survivor who went back to her town in Germany and went to the corner grocery store. And, the grocery, says hello. And she looked down and she saw his SS boots that he hadn't even taken off. And that speaks to what I've never forgotten that. Just, how many years it's been since I've heard that, but that's, to me, it's chilling.
Yeah.
And I can't thank you enough for what you've been willing to share. I do want to do another one later because I'm fascinated. When my daughter and I visited Germany in August 2016, we went to all these memorials because in the 70s, when I lived in Germany, those didn't exist. And I thought, how interesting. So I would like to talk to you about why perhaps it's not working in terms of education. So I
can just say it right now. We have the AfD in the
yes,
parliament.
yes, and we saw now I get really upset. We saw the posters in 2016. So ever since then, I've not tracked like an historian, the rising number. So for those people listening who don't know, it's the Alternative for Deutschland for Germany, and it's the far right. And well, Karen could tell you more, but it's frightening that they're now growing in strength.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's why Never Again is Now podcast is being launched now. Thank you, Karen Youngblood, for being our guest. We really appreciate it. Thank you for those of you listening. Do check out, for those of you listening, Evelyn Marcus's powerful documentary about anti-Semitism at joinneveragainisnow.com, and check out my Holocaust nonfiction play at Thin Edge of the Wedge.com, thinedgeofthewedge.com. And whenever you can, we encourage you to speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.